Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LCK round number 3 overview and analysis video. Very excited to get into this, a lot to go over. That is incredibly interesting in these two series that we're going to cover in today's video. Of course, winners, finals, which will determine our first representative from the LCK to qualify for the World Championships, what with the way championship points are working out. Whoever wins that series will at the very least be the 2 seed from the LCK at Worlds and auto-qualify through points alone, which is big. And then, of course, another team will officially be eliminated from the LCK playoffs in our lower bracket matchup. So, some really intriguing series to go over today, but I would love to know you guys' thoughts on these series down in the comments section below. Who do you think played well? Who do you think did not play well? Did things go as you expected, or were there some upsets? I'd love to know your thoughts and opinions. Of course, you'll get mine throughout this series. I've been giving my predictions throughout all of the LCK playoffs up until this point, but I guess we'll have to find out if those are going to come true. Of course, we're going to jump into it right now. I don't want to waste too much of you guys' time, but if you are new here, what we're going to do in this video is go game by game, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game in each series, and then at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to kind of tie everything all together. I'll be doing a quick overview of, kind of the semifinals, if you will, the third place matchup there, the losers finals at the end of the video, since we will know that matchup, but most of this video is just going to pertain the two matchups that we saw this weekend. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Our first matchup is going to be that winners finals matchup, and this is the one that I was much more intrigued to see, because I know a lot of people didn't expect to see these two teams play off against each other. I've seen a lot of people disagree with how high I've been on both of these teams, but I think both of them have proven me relatively right over the course of the playoffs up until this point, and one of them will be going to Worlds after this series. It's a matchup between the number 2 seeded Gen.G and the number 5 seeded T1. Things have really gone according to plan, I would say, for both of these teams. Gen.G obviously not having to play in round 1, being a top 2 seed, but not being number 1, so they didn't get to choose their opponent. Luckily for them, KT on the other side picked probably the harder matchup against T1, and so they ended up going up against Hanwha Life, and that series is just super in their favor. I've talked about why that is just such a miserable series matchup-wise for Hanwha in a lot of different videos in the past, and so I'm not going to go into it again, but Gen.G definitely proving me right in that case and being able to defeat them very cleanly in a 3-0 sweep where it really wasn't all that close basically at any point. Gen.G almost gave over the lead in a couple of those games, but they were just better in the team fights, and so it didn't really matter by the end of the game. And then T1, definitely a different path. Obviously struggled so much without Faker in the regular season, but things have really started to come back together in the playoffs, and they've shown the upside that we all knew that they've had over the course of this year. You've seen everybody on this team really play well. They dominated DK. They were the better team in that series. They were better than KT Rolster, and they were able to take that even though it was a close 5-game series. KT was the number 1 seed heading into playoffs, and they looked unstoppable. They had not lost a game in, 8 weeks, and so 2 months? And so or a series, I should say, not a game, but T1, taking them down is massive, and now they get a face-off against their bitter rival in Gen.G, who they've gone up against a billion times in the playoffs at this point over the past few years. Really excited to see this matchup. I have Gen.G going over in this one. That was my prediction. I think Gen.G is the best team in the LCK right now. I definitely put that out in the ether in my playoff primer before playoffs started, and it's looking good, but T1 obviously is a really good team, and if they're able to get the job done and move into finals, I'm really not going to be all that surprised if they actually secretly, with Faker, are the best team in the LCK at the current moment. But is that going to be the case, or is Gen.G actually going to continue this kind of run that they've been going on, being relatively unbeatable? Well, we're going to, of course, start off with game number 1 to find out who's going to come out on top, and the winner of game number 1 was Gen.G. They are going to take the first game in this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and obviously that is a very, very big place to be if you are Gen.G. I always talk about games 1, 2, and obviously 5 being the most important in the entire series, because game 1 really does set the tempo. Game 2 really matters for not going down 0-2 if you were the team that lost game 1, and obviously game 5 do or die. But Game 1 is arguably the most important game of the series because it just gives you so much more momentum, so much more control over how the rest of that series does end up going, and I really do think Gen.G played this game number 1 really well. They were definitely the better team. Their macro is insane. They are the best macro team in the LCK, and I don't think it's particularly close. I think KT is obviously up there as well. They're a good macro team, but Gen.G just plays the map so efficiently, and I really do think that has a lot to do with this mid-jungle duo, which just continues to be the driving force of this team in the playoffs. They have my personal pick for MVP in Pays, but, you know, in the playoffs so far, it's been Peanut, and most specifically, it's been Chovy, who's going to get my player of the game here in game number 1. A fantastic Taliyah performance. I can remember back to a time where, and I'm sure that, you know, this prevailing thought still exists, where Chovy was like, oh, you know, he's never going to be a player that can actually be on winning teams. He's always going to be a little bit too selfish. He's going to focus on his laning. He's going to focus on his farm. He's never going to help out the rest of the map. And picks like Taliyah, I think, are, you know, picks that you need to be moving around the map. You can't be stationary. You can't, like, solo carry on Taliyah in that sense with just your damage, right? You have to be active, and, you know, that's a pick that I think a lot of people would say that Chovy wouldn't necessarily be super proactive on, but Chovy was phenomenal in this game. This is one of the better Taliyah performances that we've seen in a while, considering this champion has kind of fallen out of the meta, but I do like the matchup into Azir quite a bit. You can get the shove relatively early so long as you're a good enough player to be able to lane against a good Azir player, and if you do have that shove, all of a sudden you are everywhere on the map. Like, your jungler's game becomes so much easier, your bot lane's game becomes so much easier, just in general, everything becomes easier for the rest of your team if Taliyah is out and about and helping out the team, and I think Chovy did a fantastic job in this game of actually being able to help out the rest of his team with that Taliyah, so really good performance. I do think the rest of the team also showed up. Peanut was really good in this game. Owner had a little bit of a good early game, which you kind of have to on the Rel, and we've seen this before, specifically from T1, where the Rel can be super proactive in terms of ganks in the early game and can actually create a pretty big disparity in terms of aggression early on, and I think Owner did a good job of taking advantage of that. However, Peanut was so much more proactive in the mid to late game, especially the mid game, that by the time we hit 20 minutes, by the time we hit the team fight stage, Rel actually was behind, and all of a sudden, that full engage that Rel offers as a champion is no longer all that valuable, because you've got a Sedge, you've got a Jax, you've got a Lulu. You have a lot of ways to peel this Aphelios, right? Who is going to be your main damage dealer over the back half of the game. And I think Peanut obviously was a big reason for that. Being able to just out-team fight a lot of T1 just in general. Peanut and Chovy, I think both were massive, massive pieces this game. Chovy has been fantastic. Peanut has been fantastic over the course of this playoff run. And they continue to prove why I think it's just disrespectful to call them anything other than one of the top 2 or 3 jungle mid duos in the entire world. Right up there with basically anybody else that you want to talk about at the current moment. But the rest of this team played well. Pays obviously did his job in the late game. Delight was solid, was often the target for a lot of those engages, but as Lulu, you're happy to give up your life if it means the rest of your team is going to survive, and Doran was fine. He ended up winning the matchup on top side as a Jax into an Ornn, which obviously is positive, I would say, overall for Gen.G. We'll talk about the Ornn pick in a second, because a lot of people are complaining about it, and I do kind of agree with their sentiments, but I think Gen.G did everything they were supposed to do in this game. And then for T1 on the other side, not really a great game 1. Obviously, like I said, you had some moments in the early game. Owner in particular, I think, did do relatively okay in the early game, trying to create that pressure, trying to create that aggression on the Rel. You just weren't really able to maintain it at all. I think a lot of people are criticizing the Ornn pick because Zeus has pretty clearly been T1's best player in the playoffs. He's certainly been the one that they played through the most, which I don't think a lot of people were expecting, but he has been phenomenal. Probably the single best player in the LCK playoffs up until this point in terms of what he's been able to do, and you stick him on Ornn duty, and he can't really do anything. Zeus was relatively okay in this game, but again, he's not going to be able to carry on this champion. You're relying on the bot side of your map to be able to step up, and while, you know, Faker and Guma are good carries, they both just weren't good enough in this game. Dud of the game is going to go to Faker on the Azir. He was consistently looking for engages on Azir when you've got an Alistar, when you've got a Rel, when you've got an Ornn. You have a lot of go buttons here. You don't need to pull off this fantastic Shuriman and shuffle with Azir in order to make these plays happen, and it felt like Faker was consistently going for them even when he didn't have to. He built full damage this game. No crown. He went Leandries instead, which I do like on Azir, especially if you're going to be more of a damage dealer, more of a late game hyper carry, which I think is good for this comp, but the problem is he just didn't necessarily play it like that. If he had been a little bit safer in some of these fights, I do think that it actually could have been better for T1, so not exactly the best game number 1 for Faker. Guma was just kind of meh. This game on the Xayah was dealing damage, but it certainly wasn't enough. Obviously, the Aphelios was just much stronger towards the back half of the game, and that's what's going to happen, and everybody else on the team is basically there to try to support the Azir towards towards the back half, you're relying a ton on Faker in this game to be your main damage dealer in the back half, and I just don't think it necessarily went well for them. So for T1, you're now down 0-1. Obviously, series isn't over by any stretch of the imagination. Going down 0-1 is not something that this team is unfamiliar with, but you don't want to go down 0-2. That's going to be a disaster spot for T1, especially against a team like Gen.G, who's not really going to give up a lead like that, right? Winning 3 games in a row against Gen.G is very, very hard, and you don't want to force yourself to do that. So big game 2 here. Gen.G could take a commanding series lead, or T1 could even up the score, but which is going to happen? Well, the winner of game number 2 was T1. They are going to take game 2. They're going to tie up this series at 1 apiece, and this is a big win for them. Obviously, you don't want to go down 0-2 to Gen.G. That's just not the position you ever really want to be in. 3 games in a row against a team like Gen.G with Peanut and Chovy and Pays and Doran and Delight, and as cohesive as they play, their macro game, like their experience in the playoffs, I wouldn't want to do that, right? I don't want to go down 0-2 to a team like Gen.G. So T1 winning this game 2, I think, is pretty massive for them. Now, this was also a pretty dominant win, I would say, from them, but this was a big macro win as well. Game 1, I think, was very macro-focused rather than a bunch of big mechanical outplays or anything like that, dominating lane, etc., etc. I think you could attribute game number 2 a little bit more to, like, dominant lane presence, a little bit more to just kind of winning early, but I think a lot of that has to do with what they did with that lane presence, right? Like, I think it's kind of difficult to just say that they were winning lane and they took that gold lead into dominating team fights, right? That's not exactly what happened this game. They were able to get priority in a lot of different lanes, even in lanes they probably shouldn't have been able to get a significant amount of priority into, and then we're just able to dominate the map by getting every objective and constantly having more numbers and more positions, just being really good over the course of this game, and I think that definitely helped them out. So let's talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Faker. Kind of criticized him for the Azir game in game 1, if only because I honestly thought he was too aggressive in terms of how he played it. I think if he had played a little bit more back, a little bit more control-oriented, I do think that that game is a little bit easier to win for T1, but you can't say anything negative about him here in game 2. Playing Azir into Ahri isn't always exactly the matchup that you want if you're the Azir, right? Because you're going to lose priority in the early game. That's just naturally how that goes. Or you would think that's naturally how that goes, especially with Chovy on the Ahri. You've got Vi Ahri. That seems like a very good combination to be able to do exactly what Gen.G did in game number 1, which is move around the map, basically make every play that you want to make, but that's not how this game went at all. Faker was incredibly active on the map. He was able to get the shove, and he was able to help out Owner a ton, who, we'll talk about Owner. He made quite a few mistakes in this game on the Kazakhs and did almost throw away some of the leads that T1 was generating, but Faker was so clinical in terms of how he played the map that it's a pretty easy choice for player of the game. He was excellent. I think if they had a worse mid laner who was just kind of average on Azir and allowed Chovy to move around the map and the Ahri was more active, then I don't think T1 wins this game nearly as easily, if at all, right? Because I do think that Gen.G had their opportunities and their moments with some of the players in this game, but Faker, I think, dismantled that. I think you got to give a lot of credit to Guma and Keria in that same vein as well, because they also had a lot of priority in the bot lane, and so they were also always first to a lot of plays, specifically Keria, who was everywhere on the map in this game. Now, that's a little bit more expected because, Xayah Alistar should have prio into Zeri Rakan. There really isn't any way for Zeri Rakan to win that unless the Xayah Alistar really screws up, and so, it's good to see them actually perform, but they do have to step up and perform, right? Like, you have to expect them to be able to do it, and I do think that they were able to do it here. Like I said, I think Owner struggled a little bit in this game in terms of not throwing away some of the advantages that he was kind of gifted by the rest of his team, but still, he was doing a lot of damage on the Kazakhs, even if I do think that he continues to be a little bit of a liability. Zeus was kind of a non-factor on the top side, but it is what it is. Faker, Guma, Keria were massive this game, and I think they really helped T1 across the finish line. And then for Gen.G on the other side, how do you lose pressure in the early game as Vi Ahri? Like, how does that even happen? How do you allow that to happen? That feels like a massive misplay by these two. Now, Peanut, I think, really struggled a lot. He's going to get my dud of the game. He needed to be way more active in the early game, especially going into something like Kazakhs. Vi is already a champion that I think struggles if she's not able to survive in the late game, similar to something like a Jarvan that I've talked about previously, where Vi has to go in. Rel, in a similar vein, has to go in, and so if those engages aren't necessarily consistent, or if, Vi goes in and immediately gets blown up, then that champion isn't nearly as strong as she needs to be, and so so you do need to play a little bit aggressive in the early game, and it just didn't feel like there was enough aggression coming out from Peanut. Chovy, I think, had a rough one as well on the Ahri. Mid laners have kind of traded good and bad games so far in this series, and I think that that's definitely interesting, but these are things I would expect to get better. Chovy was, ult dashing and then missing charm, and I just don't expect that to happen the entire series. That's not Chovy, right? It's a bad game, and that's going to happen, but, Pays and Delight lost the push early, even though they were kind of good in the late team fights. Doran was, again, fine in the top lane. I would still say was better in game 2, but not by like a ridiculous amount. It really was a mid-diff, honestly, if I'm being entirely honest, and then Peanut, I think, really struggling to generate a lot of advantages. And so for Gen.G, the series is now tied up at 1-1. For T1, the series is now tied up at 1-1, and so anybody can take control. Game 3 is going to be important to really corral this series back in for these teams. Of course, you don't want to have to win both of the final 2 games, and so winning game 3 could definitely put you in a much better spot. But who's going to be able to do that? Well, the winner of game number 3 was T1. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to take control of this series, going up 2-1. And again, this is a massive win for a team that just feels like they're on a massive up streak right now. It almost feels like they can't do anything wrong, which obviously isn't the case, but it just goes to show you how well they're playing at the current moment. This is the form T1 was in for a lot of the spring split when we were calling them, one of, if not the best team in the world, right up there with JD Gaming. They were, all 5 all-pro first team, right? Like, this was a dominant team, and it does feel like we've gotten a lot closer to that version of T1 than basically anything that we've seen in the regular season up until this point. They're still continuing to pull out the picks that they feel most comfortable on, even if they're not meta. Obviously, the Corki in the mid lane is always very fun, but they're undefeated on it. Faker is still undefeated on it in the playoffs, and so massive stuff from T1. And then Gen.G on the other side, you've got to feel a little disappointed, quite frankly. You're just not playing well up until this point. We were concerned a little bit, I guess, after the Hanwha Live series because they weren't holding on to leads nearly as clinically as maybe you would want one of the best teams in the world to do, but to see them struggle so much to do some of these basic mechanic things in games 2 and 3, it really is concerning. A couple of these players that I would have just expected to play better and just aren't at the current moment. So we'll talk about them in a bit, but let's start off, of course, talking about T1. Player of the game for me is pretty easily going to go to Keria in the support position. Another fantastic game for this T1 bot lane for both Guma and Keria, and I do think that both of them deserve a pretty big shout out here because I think their domination of this bot lane 2v2 over the course of the last 2 games has been incredibly important. I talked about Faker getting the advantage in that Azir versus Ahri matchup, and obviously that being a big turning point for why T1 was able to win the mid game so hard, but you have to talk about this 2v2 here in the bot lane, right? Like, not only were Guma and Keria great in that game 2, able to get the full push in that matchup, but they did the same thing again here in game 3. And not only were they able to get pushed, they got 2v2 kills, right? Like, they won 2 straight up 2v2s against the enemy team and were able to get a bunch of gold off of that. Keria was then able to move around the map on this Rakan, create a ton of panic, and, by the time you hit the mid game, like, T1 had spiraled this game so far out of control. The Xayah was doing so much damage. The Corki was actually doing so much on the map for T1 that it was very difficult for them to be able to lose that game, right? And so they didn't. They just kind of, walked their way into the end. And it's very impressive. Again, I can't stress enough how these are not particularly strong comps that they're playing right now, but they're so comfortable on comps like this. And, their bot lane, I think, is playing at such a high level that these games do end up working out for them and do end up working out in general. And so big ups to Keria, big ups to Gumayushi. I thought they were fantastic. Of course, Faker was, again, really good in this game on the Corki. He's so good at this champion. It's actually absurd. I know that there are a lot of champions that you can kind of associate with Faker as a player. I think LeBlanc is one of the main ones. Zed, obviously, for a long time because of those plays. Ahri, is Azir. He's played more than anybody else. Like, there are a lot of champions that I think fall into, oh, this is a Faker champion. Ryze, another one. But Corki has to be in there as well, I think, because he just continues to play it, even in metas where Corki is not particularly great, and continues to be one of the best players on the Rift with it every single time. And so, really impressive stuff. Now, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for T1. Owner did try to throw the game as much as he could in the early game. Not exactly sure what he was trying to do, just consistently dying to the enemy team, consistently giving over gold. Owner's kind of been a problem for this team in this series up until this point in all 3 games, even in their 2 wins, but it hasn't mattered as much. He did play the late game much better. He was much better in the team fighting stage, but his early game was not good. Luckily for him, every other lane won, including Zeus in the top lane, and we already talked about mid and bot. And so, good stuff for T1. They're better as a team overall, even if they do still have some flaws. And then for Gen.G on the other side, they're just not playing well. There really is no excuse that I could possibly give at this moment. They're just not playing at a very high level. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Pays in the bot lane. I'm not going to say that he's been, like, bad in the playoffs, but he certainly has not been a driving force for this team in the playoffs quite like he was in the regular season. He was my MVP pick. I do think he was the most valuable player to his team's success this split. And I do think that he has struggled a bit in the playoffs, certainly to live up to that expectation, but even to just kind of be a positive force for this team, he's been bad in games 2 and 3, and I think that that's worth pointing out. Delight hasn't necessarily been better, but I do think Pays is playing worse, which is definitely concerning. He was really good in the playoffs in spring, and he was good at MSI as well, and so interesting to see that he is struggling so much here. It's not necessarily a nerves thing, I would guess. I think he's just kind of having a rough patch right now, but he's going to have to fix that if this team wants to be competitive. Chovy has not been good in games 2 and 3. He kind of had a faker game 1, if you will, here on the Azir, where he was consistently going for Shreem and shuffle engages when he really just shouldn't, and was consistently putting himself in danger and dying way too early in team fights because of it. Peanut was really bad down the stretch of this game, basically at the opposite arc of Owner, where he was, trying to take advantage of some of Owner's weaknesses in the early game, but by doing that, he ended up putting himself in an even worse position because he was overextending to hurt Owner, which ended up being bad. Doran has been whatever in this series up until this point, but if Chovy and Pays in particular do not step up, like, this is going to be a tough series to win for Gen.G. Those two players are such an integral part of what Gen.G is doing in terms of especially late game carrying, that if they're going to misplay in the laning phase or in late game team fights, this team's going to struggle to win. So going to be interesting, but they're now on series points. So Gen.G's got to win both of these final 2 games to go to finals. Of course, the loser is not eliminated from this series. It doesn't matter if you lose. Well, it does, but you're going to be moving down into the loser's bracket. Your 2023 is not over or anything, but obviously with a world spot on the line, you definitely want to be the team to come out of this series. So can T1 close it out in 4, or is Gen.G going to take us to a Silver Scrapes game 5? Well, the winner of game number 4 was Gen.G. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to tie up this series at 2 apiece, and we are going to a game number 5. What is it about these two teams and always playing each other so tough? I shouldn't say that, because sometimes it is a little bit of a blowout, but in this one it certainly has not been. Each game, I think, has been very decisive in terms of how it's gone down, but both teams have looked good at different points in this series, because this was a good game from Gen.G. Make no mistake about it, a lot of these players did end up playing incredibly well. I do think that T1 made a major error in draft, which I'm certainly not going to be the only one to call out, but Gen.G absolutely took advantage of that error and really capitalized on being able to play a lot more aggressive in the mid game because of the champions that were selected on the other side. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me, again, another pretty easy choice is going to go to Delight in the support position. I do think that the Gen.G bot lane has in general been a little bit disappointing over the course of the playoffs up until this point, but I do think that Delight in particular had a really good game here in game number 4. Pays obviously has been a little bit up and down over the course of the playoffs, but he definitely was the better AD carry, and I think a lot of that was because Delight was setting up so many plays across this game. The Alistar was so valuable at being able to get on what is quite frankly a short-range comp. You're relying on the Vayne, you're relying on the Jax if you're T1 on the other side. Obviously, Azir's going to be a good thing, a big piece in the end of the game, but we'll talk about Faker in a bit as well. And Delight just does a really good job of making sure that those champions don't have all that much space to breathe, if you will, a lot of room to move around and to maneuver these fights. And so good stuff from him. He was great in the early game, really shut down that Vayne as quickly as possible. The Braum really couldn't do anything to keep the Alistar off of the enemy team, and I think Delight obviously stepping up is massive for Gen.G just in general. You're really, kind of hoping and praying that you can get a good performance out of him, and I think you did. In that same vein, I do think Pays had probably his best game of the playoffs up until this point on the Zeri here. Was given a pretty easy matchup in general, but I do think he capitalized on it well. Played with his support and was able to generate some gold to get into the back half of this game on the Zeri, and then really do a lot in these team fights. Really impressive stuff. Obviously, when you're talking about team fights, you have to point out the Gangplank on the top side of the map. Doran, in particular, in this game just played really interestingly. He got demolished in the early laning phase, as Gangplank can tend to do. Zeus actually did a great job of being able to generate a lead, and he was by far the strongest and best piece on T1 in this game again, which has been a pretty common trend throughout the playoffs for Zeus, but Gangplank never dies. This guy, no matter how far behind that champion is, he's still going to be ridiculously useful when you hit the team fight stage, and that's what he was. He was doing so much damage that it didn't really matter that he lost lane. He was so dominant in the back half of the game that he honestly was in conversation for being my player of the game in game number 4. Peanut and Chovy were again really good. Peanut in particular, I think, did a good job of asserting that pressure and being able to play consistently, but Chovy was good on the Yone, an aggressive pick, but wasn't nearly as aggressive as his counterpart, and that was a positive overall for him and the team. But I think it was Pays, Delight, and Doran that really were the standout players. Peanut obviously had a good game too. I think Gen.G in general just looked a lot more complete in this game, and this was a lot more, I think, according to plan for Gen.G. And then for T1 on the other side of the map, why are you picking Vayne, man? This champion is so bad. Like, I know that the AD carry pool is very vast and very open right now, and a lot of players and a lot of teams have been experimenting with a lot of different picks, even in the playoffs, and this team in particular, T1 and Gumayushi, have not been afraid to go to a lot of the picks that I consider to be weak. We saw Sivir, we saw, Ezreal, we saw Lucian, we saw, a lot of these champions that I don't think a lot of people are considering super strong. Ezreal maybe doesn't deserve to be in that conversation, but especially in comparison to, like, the more consistent AD carries, I do think that he is. But Vayne is just, like, a step too far, and I don't know if Guma just doesn't feel like he wants to play the meta champions. Like, obviously he plays Xayah and it was banned out this game, and we know he plays Kai'Sa if it's available, but where is Aphelios? Where is even something like a Jinx? Like, where are these more consistent bot laners? Why are you not picking Zeri? Like, I don't understand why you feel like you have to go to these, like, crazy off-meta wild picks, because Vayne is not good, and it very much did not work this game. Guma is going to get my dud of the game. Vayne was miserable. Like, there was nothing that Vayne could do in this game, and it honestly was a big problem for T1, because they needed this Vayne to be strong, to make the mid-late game even playable for them. Zeus did a good job of being able to generate a lead in the early game, but he was also way too over-aggressive in terms of pushing side lanes towards the back half, and as soon as he would go down, like, T1 lost all pressure on the map. Like, if he died, T1 lost everything. Faker was miserable in this game. This was basically game 1 for him, but worse, where he was my dud of the game, where he would try and full engage on Azir and then just die immediately and not accomplish anything when he has full engage threats elsewhere on the team. I don't know what it is on Azir. Chovy did it in game 3. Faker's done it in games 1 and 4. What is going on? Like, do you just get mind controlled, like brainwashed into feeling like you have to Shuriman and shuffle on this champion? Because you don't. You do a ridiculous amount of damage. You're a backline. You're basically an AP carry, right? You're a marksman on the backline here, and nobody's playing him like that in this series, and it's very concerning. But just in general, I do think that T1 made a lot of major mistakes in this game, and they got caught for it, and now they're going to a game 5. Hopefully they don't draft like this again, because I do think they put themselves in a bad spot, but Faker, they, like, Guma, Owner, they have to play better. It really does feel like whichever jungle mid duo and bot lane in particular end up coming out on top in these games just wins. Like, it's straight up going to be better, and so if you get a good game out of Chovy, Pays, and Delight, Gen.G's probably going to win. If you get a good game out of Faker, Guma, and Keria, T1's probably going to win, so going to be interesting to see how that happens, but winner's going to be going to Worlds. It's a do-or-die game number 5 here. Very, very fun, very big circumstances, but who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 5 was Gen.G. They are going to take Game 5. They're going to close out this series with a 3-2 win, and they are officially heading to the 2023 World Championships. Congratulations to Gen.G. This is what I predicted. I predicted them to be able to get through winners finals, not only in the previous video against T1, but in my playoff primer originally against KT Rolster when I predicted that, but I think Gen.G is the best team in the LCK, and I think they did a pretty good job of at least trying to prove that in this series. It certainly was not the cleanest series of all time from either of these two teams. Both of them, in their losses, quite frankly, did not look all that good. I think they both struggled quite a bit to maintain, like, superiority throughout the series, but Gen.G being the one to be able to come out on top is massive, obviously, for them, and they're going to be moving on to the LCK Finals as well, which is just very, very big in general. Unfortunately for T1, that means they move down to lower bracket. We'll talk about that in a second. They're going to play the winner of the series that we'll talk about later in the video here, but for Gen.G, congratulations to this team. I do think that in their wins, the players that needed to step up absolutely stepped up. We talked about Chovy in game 1, but outside of that, it really was the bot lane that was kind of the central lane for what Gen.G wanted to do, and man, did I really need to see that, because I really do think that the bot lane had kind of been the lackluster part of Gen.G, for lack of a better term, through the first couple of series. I should say against Hanwha Life. It really isn't the first couple of series, but against Hanwha Life, and they were struggling like in game number 3, and so I needed to see these final 2 games from them, and man, did they show up in these final 2. But player of the game for me in game 5 is actually going to go to Peanut in the jungle. A ton of pressure in the early game from T1 onto Peanut to try to take him out of the game as quickly as possible, but but as is traditional, Peanut is legitimately the best jungler of all time to play from behind, right? That's something that we talk about on this channel a lot. Is a lot of junglers are really good from ahead, and honestly, we kind of typecast a lot of junglers as being good from ahead and, needing early resources in order to win. That's a very common archetype for junglers, but a very uncommon archetype for junglers is somebody who is consistently able to keep the game close, even when they don't necessarily have the most jungle pressure, and that's what separates, I think, Peanut from other junglers, is he is the greatest jungler of all time at being able to play from a disadvantaged state. It's not easy to do in that role, but Peanut makes it look so effortless, and he did it again in this game. Throughout the first 5 to 10-ish minutes in the game, Peanut did not have an advantage on Owner, but he was so much more useful on the map than what Owner was, and by the time we hit the late game, Peanut was the best player on the Rift. The Maokai was super important at being able to get objectives and being able to initiate team fights in small areas, and so you gotta give him a lot of credit. Peanut's awesome, and he continues to be awesome. He's a big reason why this Gen.G team is here, even if people continue to undervalue him as one of the greatest junglers of all time. Player of the series for me, though, is not gonna go to Peanut in the jungle. It's gonna go to Delight in the support position. Was awesome this series, with the exception of Game 3. I am willing to say that, but I don't think there was anybody on Gen.G that was just straight up good in all 5 games. Like, it just wasn't the case, but I think if you take Game 3 out in particular, Delight had a great series. He was awesome in Game 1, but really he shined in Games 4 and 5. The most important games in the series is really where he stepped up. I was concerned that Delight was just going to be kind of going along with the flow, and if, players like Pays and Chovy weren't stepping up, that he wasn't going to look nearly as good in those situations, but he has been a bit of a driving force for this team throughout this split. I think it's the best split of his career, even in comparison to Spring, and I do think that he has raised his stock a lot in my eyes, and he was great in this series. Pays was good down the stretch. 4 and 5 were good for him. Chovy definitely struggled, I think, down the stretch a little bit more than the rest of his team. The bot lane was definitely more of a focus, but, his game 1 was spectacular, so that is definitely something to say, but, he was probably the worst performing member of the team over the back half, and they still were able to beat T1, which is massive, and Doran was obviously really good in that same vein. I just think everybody on Gen.G kind of stepped up, especially this bot lane and jungle Peanut in particular, but for T1 on the other side, obviously going down the loser's bracket is not ideal for this team, but I think this is a place that a lot of people thought that they were going to be in a couple of days ago, so I don't think they're going to take it too harshly. They're still at worst top 3 and still absolutely have the opportunity to win one more series and auto-qualify themselves for Worlds as well, and so they're not out of the woods just yet, but they're pretty darn close, and so let's talk about, what ended up going wrong this series and just kind of giving an idea of where they could be standing. Dud of the game for me is going to go to Faker in the mid lane again. Azir felt like such a trap this series, and not because I think Azir is a bad pick, but because it felt like consistently these players were not necessarily doing the things that Azir is really good at right now, which is just consistent damage out of the mid lane in a lot of these late game team fights. I don't think this game it mattered nearly as much, but Faker really struggled on Azir throughout this series. Game 1, 4, and 5 were all bad Azir games from Faker, even if Game 2 was a good Azir game from Faker, so very interesting to see him struggle so much on a champion that he has a ton of experience on and has been really good at in the past, but it just didn't feel like it felt like he put too much of a responsibility on himself to be the one to make a lot of these plays, and I do think it hurt the team overall. Owner continues to just not really be all that good in the jungle. His rapid descent here in the summer split is certainly concerning. He is, not playing well at the current moment, even with Faker back in the lineup. He's had good games here or there, but when you look at the grand scheme of things, he's really kind of been not good for this T1 team, and he especially wasn't good when Faker was in, and so certainly concerned to see where that ends up going. Guma and Kerry, I think, struggled in Game 5 here. Zeus had his worst game of the series in Game 5 here, and so everything just kind of went wrong for T1 down the stretch of the series, but again, they're not eliminated. They're going to play the winner of KT and Hanwha Life, which they should be able to beat. They've already proven that they can beat KT, but I do think, obviously, that's a very interesting series, and certainly not one that I think T1's going to feel locked in on being able to win. They're going to have to try, and then I think if they do face Hanwha, they're going to feel a lot more confident about that series just in general, but I do think that T1 still has the opportunity to be one of those teams that makes finals, that auto-qualifies for Worlds, that does not have to deal with the regional qualifier, and I think that would obviously be preferable for an Oregon team like T1, considering how well they did in Spring, but, Gen.G, congratulations to them. They're going to be moving on to the LCK Finals. They're going to be moving on to the World Championships, but I'm sure they're going to have the upcoming series very much in their sights because they've still got one more series to complete if they do want to become the 2-time 2023 LCK champions. And now moving on to our second series, and this is the lower bracket series to talk about today, which means that one of these two teams is going to be leaving this series eliminated from the LCK playoffs. Now, obviously, they have all already qualified for the regional qualifiers, so they'll still have an opportunity to play their way into the World Championships, but being able to keep your season alive and being able to potentially still auto-qualify without ever having to go through the regional qualifiers by winning the LCK split would be massive for either of these two teams. So, still quite a bit on the line, and certainly not a series that you would want to lose if you're either of these teams. Of course, it's a matchup between the number 1 seeded KT Rolster and the number 3 seeded Hanwha Life Esports. I think it's really interesting to see both of these teams here in lower bracket after round number 2, because I think that, you know, in KT's case, they certainly probably weren't expecting themselves to be here. They picked T1 for crying out loud and did end up going into that, but this is going to be a really good judge as to whether or not that was a massive mistake for them. If they come into this series and absolutely destroy Hanwha Life, obviously they probably should have picked them and they should be in winners finals right now, but if they come into the series and it's a lot closer, or Hanwha kind of destroys them and shows like they're actually as good of a team as, you know, maybe some people thought they were, then maybe KT just wasn't cut out to be the number 1 seed in the first place. So a lot on the line, I would say, for KT in terms of just like public perception in the series, let alone confidence moving into the rest of the year. But this is still a really good team, and I still think that they are more than the sum of their parts, which I think is a compliment, not an insult. I don't think these players are bad by any means. Their parts are really good. I just think that, you know, in comparison to like T1 or Gen.G, you wouldn't necessarily, even Hanwha Life, you wouldn't necessarily look at their parts and be like, oh, they're going to be dominant. They're going to be easily the best team in the league. But every single player on this team makes each other better, and they all play like the best players in the league when they get to play as a unit and as 5, and their macro's really good, etc., etc. When they're able to generate consistent leads in the early game, they are able to, you know, translate that into easy wins. And that's why KT Rolster's been one of the best teams in the world over the back half of the year. But for Hanwha, they've really come on as of late. Obviously, Zeka is a big part of this team. Viper's the most consistent AD carry in the LCK. I don't even think that's really all that up for debate at this point. He's just been really good for this team. Obviously, Pays is great, but even he's had his down moments. Viper just doesn't play bad. He just isn't always the main focal point of this team, and that's where Hanwha has really struggled, is that when you look at their game plan, and I know people are probably tired of hearing me talk about this, it's Grizzly and Zeka. These are the two players that really matter for Hanwha Life. When Grizzly is able to get early leads, and when he's able to really translate that into getting Zeka ahead in the mid lane, Hanwha Life's very difficult to beat. In fact, they're almost impossible to beat from that circumstance. The problem is that Grizzly still is a pretty inexperienced player, and he's someone who is struggling against some of the best junglers in the league, which Cuz absolutely is. And so I think you could look at that as a potential worry for Hanwha Life, but Zeka also has to step up. He's someone who is very feast or famine in terms of his performances, but when he's doing well, this team dominates because Viper's going to be consistent, and if you have that, you know, main carry in Zeka, that's going to be big. But when Zeka struggles, like, Viper's not the kind of player that 1v9s, right? He just has not been able to do that at this split up until this point. He is a good player, and he's never the problem, right? But I think Zeka and Grizzly matter a lot to this team and are probably the two most important players. I've said that all year long, but those two are going to have to step up. KT is going to have to shut them down. It's going to be a pretty straightforward series to see how that ends up happening, but we're going to find out if that can happen early on here as we kick it off with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was KT Rolster. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and they're going to show that, actually, no, we're still really freaking good. We're still a really good League of Legends team. We're going to draft a lot of things that are, you know, relatively popular, but specifically in other regions, this is a very, like, North America comp. This is a very LCS comp in terms of what KT Rolster ended up going for in this game, which I do find very interesting, but Hanwha Life going for something that's a lot more standard, something that we've seen a lot more in the LCK playoffs, and just not executing nearly as well. I talked about that team being very good from ahead and very bad from behind, which I do think is a pretty accurate way to describe Hanwha in general, but KT demolished them in the early game, which meant that this game fell off the rails incredibly quickly. I honestly don't even think a 30-minute game does justice to just how far ahead KT was. They were giving over things in the mid-game basically for free, simply because they had so much pressure to be able to put elsewhere on the map, which is obviously crazy that that is the circumstance that ended up happening, but KT was the better team by a crazy margin in this game number 1. Player of the game was incredibly easy for me to decide. That's going to go to BDD in the mid lane on that Xerath. Fantastic Xerath game. Now, this is a champion that we're really not seeing a lot from Eastern regions. We saw it 0 times in the LPL. We're not really seeing it a ton in the LCK, but it is picking up a lot of steam in North America. In the LCS, we've been seeing specifically a lot of, you know, the North American mid lane players, you know, players like APA picking up this and really trying to make a big impact on the game overall. Now, it's been a little bit hit or miss for those players, but when you're as good as BDD is, especially on poke champions in particular, obviously, people rightfully point to his Zoe, which is his signature pick, but when you're as good at those champions as BDD is, this Xerath looks like a script. Like, you know what I mean? It just looks absolutely absurd to watch. He does not miss any of his skill shots, and he does a ridiculous amount of damage in this game. This was a no-brainer player of the game for me. If he's going to be able to get a champion like this and dominate, like, in the level that he did in this game, KT Rolster is going to be impossible to beat, because this was a top 1 performance from BDD in this game. He has been a major positive for KT Rolster over the course of this year, obviously. I'm a little bit higher on his spring split than I was on his summer, but that's only because I feel like KT as a team got better in summer, and so less of the focus, I think, was on BDD in the summer split, but he's still arguably the best player on this team. Him, Lehens, and Keen are going to be the ones that are kind of fighting for that, and I think that all of them have, at certain points in this year, kind of earned that title, but BDD, at the very least, deserves to be mentioned there, and I think the rest of the team obviously played really well. Lehens and Keen, speaking of them, had really good games. Keen on the Ornn as more of an initiator, a facilitator, and the Lehens is obviously the main facilitator and initiator on this team, but both of them did a great job of being able to both peel and set up for this kind of long-range comp, and then Cuz and Aiming were there to clean up the scraps after Xerath was able to poke down the entire enemy team, and so really well executed by KT Rolster. Kind of a risky comp to go for in game number 1 here, and you certainly don't have the best objective control, and it's not a comp that you can play if you're a worse team, but KT's not a worse team, or at least they weren't here in game number 1, so they were able to pilot it and dominate on it here. And then for Hanwha on the other side, this was a bad game. Like, you played bad, in my opinion. You just were never able to tussle or skirmish at all at any point in this game. It always felt like you were consistently on the back foot, even when you were getting objectives for free, which is wild to me that you can get so much on the map and still feel like you have so little across this game. And I think that's a great way to describe what Game 1 felt like for Hanwha. Dead of the game could go to literally anyone, probably except for Viper, who wasn't particularly good, but he certainly wasn't the biggest problem in this game. I'm going to go ahead and give it to Life in the support position because he died the most, and Leona, I think, was the most noticeable in terms of making a little bit too aggressive of plays, but give this to Grizzly for getting out jungled so hard in the early game and never recovering. Give this to Zeka for being really bad on the Azir and letting his lane opponent dominate the game. Give it to Kingen for having literally no impact on the Renekton. Like, give it to anybody, right? Like, there's no wrong choice, I think, in this circumstance. That's how bad Hanwha played in this game. I think if they continue to play like this throughout the rest of the series, this is not going to be particularly close. They got destroyed by Gen.G. Like, yes, there were definitely moments during that series where it felt like, oh, they're starting to make a comeback in the late game, but getting swept, not being able to close out or actually come back from any of those deficits, I certainly think is something to note. And game number 1 here was just as disastrous. Players like Zeka in particular, Kingen is also in this boat, are very confidence-oriented. When they're playing well and when they're making a lot of the plays that they know that they can make, when they trust themselves, they play so much better than when they have to play a little bit from behind, and we've seen that from both of them before, and you can include players like Life and Grizzly into that conversation. And losing 4 games in a row in pretty dominant fashion like they have right now certainly is not going to ignite a lot of confidence in this team, so you really got to win game 2. Game 2 becomes infinitely more important here for Hanwha, because if you go down 0-2 to KT Rolster after going down 0-3 to Gen.G, I can't imagine that the confidence or the momentum is going to be even remotely in your favor, and KT is going to feel really good about that. But after game 1, KT looks dominant. They just have to be able to keep it up. If they win in the early game again, I just don't see a lot of ways for Hanwha Life to be able to come back and close out games like that. And so, big game 2 here for both of these teams, but who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was KT Rolster. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and all of a sudden, things are looking a lot more grim for Hanwha Life than they were at the beginning of this series. Things have very much not gone their way. That is 3 total kills on their side over the first 2 games. That is not a particularly good sign. Now, there were more things in game number 1 than that, but you can't really say that all that much about game number 2. This was a domination. I think this one was arguably even more dominant than game number 1, just in how it ended up playing out, because it wasn't 1 or 2 individual players on the side of KT that were dominating. It was all 5. Everybody played well in this game, and Hanwha lost everywhere on the map. A couple of players, I think, played worse than what they did in game number 1, and I think in general, KT has taken a commanding lead in this series. Obviously, just in general, going up 2-0 is very big, but doing it in such a dominating fashion certainly does not give Hanwha Life a lot of confidence. They are 0-5 in their last 5 games. and they looked like it in this one in particular. But let's talk about KT first and foremost. My player of the game is once again going to go to BDD in the mid lane. Great Azir game coming in from him. Not that that's a particularly big surprise. This is his champion. We've seen a lot of Azir over the course of this video up until this point, including in the previous series, but this was probably the best Azir game that we have seen. He was everywhere on the map. He was consistently keeping Zeka from taking over on the Tristana. Zeka, I think, did try to take over, and he was the one player that I do want to give credit to, and we'll talk about that when we get over to the other side. But BDD, I think, was matching him in a lot of different areas, which was always going to be a pretty big positive for KT, and really what he did was allow the rest of the team to be able to play super aggressive. Aiming and Cuz, I think, both had really good games here. Lehens also had a really good game. The Poppy was incredibly influential, but I don't think any of them would have had nearly as easy of a time doing any of the things that they did in this game if it weren't for BDD on this Azir having as strong of a presence as he did end up having. So really good stuff from him. He's been phenomenal through the first two games, but like I said, this really was a team effort, and that's the KT Rolster that we all have grown to love, right? Is a team that doesn't necessarily run through one particular player, runs through all of them kind of winning, and I think that this was a lot more of an example of that than what we saw against T1, where it really was like BDD a couple of games, and then outside of that, not much coming in from KT Rolster. This was a big team experience. I think, obviously, Cousin Aiming and Lehens, I think, did a great job. That Poppy ultimate towards the back half of the game was massive from Keen to be able to keep, KT alive. Hanwha, like, making a weird choice to engage as soon as their main carry gets popped out by Poppy ultimate, but, that did a lot to help end the game from KT Rolster's side, so I'm certain they're not going to complain. Just in general, it felt like they had full control of this game basically all the way through, and that was really impressive. Not much else to say. They just looked really good. And then for Hanwha Life on the other side, they did not look good in this game. They looked really, really bad. I think you can say that, like, I don't know, maybe Zeka was a little bit more active here in game number 2 on something like the Tristana than he was in game number 1, but it certainly wasn't by, like, a gigantic margin, and he still wasn't playing, like, perfect. BDD definitely outplayed him on the other side of the map. I think Viper still has yet to be a major nuisance for the team, but everybody else has been kind of bad this series, in particular Life in the support position, who's going to get my dud of the game. He struggled a ton at the beginning of the year, not only in spring, but at the beginning of summer as well, and it feels like that version of Life has come back in the playoffs. He wasn't very good against Gen.G. He's been significantly worse against KT Rolster. This was the team that he actually really did well for last year. Him and Aiming were a really good bot lane in 2022, so to see him struggle so much on Hanwha Life, it's certainly frustrating as someone who I do think has, kind of vouched for Life over the past couple of years, but he has not had a good year, and I think the Samumu game was kind of an encapsulation of that, if you will. Talked about it a ton. When Grizzly struggles, Hanwha Life struggles, no matter if the rest of this team is playing well, and Grizzly very much has struggled. This series went for a very aggressive pick like the Rel. This is not something I would go to if I wasn't entirely confident that I was the better player on the better team in this series, and that certainly does not feel like the place that Hanwha Life is in at the current moment, so kind of shocking to see them go for this, especially into a really good scaling comp on the other side. They picked a B1, and then they ended up flexing it into the jungle, but I would have liked this significantly more as a support in this game. I think it just gives you more flexibility, but Grizzly, whatever, I don't think he piloted it well, and then King in the top lane has just not been anything this series. He's been basically irrelevant, which is kind of what happens to the top lane if the rest of the map is super explosive, and so overall, Hanwha just feels like they're not on the same level. There really isn't a lot of positives that I can throw their way when it comes to how they've played the first two games of this series. They've just been completely outplayed at basically every interval, and every advantage that they were able to get throughout this series feels like it was kind of given to them by KT Rolster, so hopefully for them, things change in game number 3. Their backs are up against the wall. They are now one game officially from being eliminated from the 2023 summer playoffs, and obviously they don't want that. They don't want to go out in 4th place, but they're going to need a pretty big miracle in order to stay alive in this series. But for KT, they're very close to moving on to that semifinals matchup against T1, and, we would really, I think, want to see a rematch of that telecom war that, KT picking T1, being here in the first place. I think it would be a lot for them to be able to potentially get their revenge in a series like that. But are they going to get that opportunity? Well, we're going to find out now. Is Hanwha Life going to be able to keep the series alive at the very least for one more game, or is KT going to shut the door on HLE and give us a 3-0 sweep? Well, the winner of game number 3 was KT Rolster. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to close out this series in a clean sweep, and they're going to end Hanwha Life Esports summer split right here and right now. Not exactly the most gracious end to a summer split that we've ever seen here in the LCK when it comes to HLE. We'll talk about them in this game. They continued to really struggle. They picked a comp that was even more aggressive than what they went for before, which we'll talk about, but KT looked utterly dominant in this series, and honestly, like, even looking back on their T1 series, there was a lot of good things to take away that I did mention in that video earlier this week, and so KT's still a team that you absolutely have to look out for as a threat to win the LCK and go to Worlds as the #1 seed from Korea in Korea, right? That's not out of the realm of possibility for KT Rolster at this tournament, and so this win was absolutely big for them, but they just demolished this series. I mean, 4 more kills in this game. That's 7 kills for Hanwha Life across 3 games this entire series. That's how dominant KT was. They were not giving anything over, especially in the final 2 games, and they looked fantastic doing it. Player of the game was a little bit more difficult in this one. I think the first 2 games it was pretty obvious, but in this one I think it really was more of a team effort again, which is what KT Rolster really wants to see. But for me, player of the game is going to go to Cuz in the jungle on the Kazakhs. Really good game from him, and he had a really good series overall. Obviously, when you're talking about teams destroying Hanwha Life, you're oftentimes going to look at the jungle matchup, because that's where Hanwha really runs a lot of their offense through, and so if they struggle as much as they did in a series like this, oftentimes it's because you're going into one of the best junglers in the world, and that's what Cuz, I think, has kind of cemented himself as over the course of this year. Now, I am still a little bit lower on him in comparison to, like, Peanut, you know what I mean? Where I think a lot of people are calling Cuz, like, easily the best jungler in the LCK. I'm not necessarily on that train in the same way that everybody else is, but I do still think Cuz is really good. A top 2 jungler in the LCK at the moment, which is a major accomplishment. It's hard to be one of the 2 best junglers in Korea. That is a pretty loaded division to be one of the best junglers in. So, really good for Cuz. Great Kazakhs game, but player of the series overall, this is going to be no surprise. Anybody who watched the series is going to probably agree with me. It's going to go to BDD in the mid lane. I mean, he was utterly ridiculous across this entire series. A fantastic performance from the KT mid laner, and, you know, him stepping up and really being as good as he was over the course of this series is just so important for what KT wants to do. Him being consistent and him being able to win on his own in the mid lane is so crucial, and he got to play more of a facilitative role here in game number 3 on the Annie, really trying to set up for that Kazakhs, for that Zeri, to be able to make some plays in the mid to late game, but by the time that the Kazakhs was super fed, like, Annie could just kind of run around and do whatever she wanted in the game because it was too out of control in favor of KT. Jungle mid was just so in their favor in this series, and that's always going to be a problem for HLE. If they're not able to win the jungle mid matchup, then the series is over, and BDD was awesome, Cuz was really good. They were the 2 players that I think stood out the most. Aiming and Lehens were good as well, so was Keem. I certainly don't want it to seem like I'm trying to put them down by saying that jungle mid was definitely the strong point for KT Rolster. I just think that everybody on this team played super well, and Cuz and BDD were probably the most obvious ones, right? This was a 5-man unit for KT Rolster that ended up taking over this game and this series, and they're going to be moving on to the semifinals to face T1. Of course, we'll preview that in just a second, but they have more than earned it. This was a really easy series for them, and they deserve to be moving on. And then for Hanwha, you got blasted 2 series in a row, once against Gen.G, once against KT Rolster. Yes, it's the 2 highest seeds in the playoffs. It's certainly not easy matchups by any means, but I do think this raises some question marks about what this team would have to do in the regional qualifier, right? They're going to play at the very least one of KT or T1 in the regional qualifier, and that's not a particularly easy matchup. And then outside of that, you got to play the winner of DK and DRX, and, you know, if Hanwha's going to be in the form, in the, you know, confidence that they're currently in, like, that's going to be a little bit of an issue for this team, because they played really bad in both of these series. Dead of the game for me is going to go to Grizzly here in game number 3. Picked the Lee Sin, really wanted to try to go, I assume, to more comfort. And Lee Sin's just one of those picks where, like, especially if you've already proven to be the worst team, like, it's just not going to work. Like, you got to be really good at Lee Sin, and you got to be really good just in general to be able to pilot this champion at a level that it would need to be piloted at for this to make sense in this spot. And so, Grizzly not coming in clutch in that respect. Kingen had a miserable game number 3, which is going to happen sometimes, but the World Ender did not end up showing up in this game. Zeka and Viper were fine in this series. They certainly were not the biggest problem. Zeka was pretty bad in game 1, but I think that, you know, Viper was fine, and Zeka was probably the best player in games 2 and 3, if you can even kind of call it that for Hanwha Life, and then Life was a problem across this whole series as well. It just really felt like this team regressed a lot back to what we thought they were in the spring split before playoffs started, where it was like, oh, this team is just never going to be able to figure it out. It seems like they're way too coin flippy. They rely way too much on jungle pressure, and, you know, when they don't get it, they just lose. Before it was Clid, and now it's Grizzly. It really does feel like a very similar story. Now, Grizzly, I think, is better at being able to transition those leads into his laners, specifically into Zeka, but I do think think that, you know, it's a similar story of if Jungle doesn't win, then Hanwha Life probably doesn't win. And I continue to think that that's going to be a major thing that does end up holding them back. Now, will it hold them out of Worlds? I do not know. I do think currently it holds them out of being one of the best teams in the world, and it certainly holds them out of being a team that I would expect to be super competitive, you know, with the best teams in the world. But, you know, if they can figure stuff out, if Grizzly can get more consistent, if Zeka and Viper can just go on this absolute tear, maybe Kingen starts to play really well down the stretch, I could see a world in which Hanwha can kind of ascend into being one of the scarier teams in the world at the moment, but it's just, it's so not there right now that it would take so much improvement to get there. I think a lot of the form that we saw at the end of the regular season had more to do with the fact that the other teams in the LCK were underperforming rather than Hanwha overperforming, and so gonna be interesting to see if that continues to hold true in the regional qualifier, but until then, congratulations to KT Rolster. They're gonna be moving on to the semifinals. They're one series away from the finals at the moment, and who's to say that this team can't be LCK champions, because the way that they're playing right now, if they can just play like this again, they already showed that they can go toe-to-toe with T1 in a close series, and they can beat Gen.G. This is absolutely a team that can threaten, and I'm really excited to see what they can do. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LCK round number 3 overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. We know our final two teams here in the LCK playoffs. Gen.G making their way not only to the LCK finals, but also to the World Championships with their win in Winners Finals. And of course, now we have T1 versus KT, a telecom war in the semifinals to see who will be joining Gen.G in that LCK final spot. Now, both of these teams have very different paths to be able to get here. T1, it's a lot more straightforward. If they win that series against KT Rolster and head to the finals, they will secure that second automatic qualification spot. They will be the other team, you know, besides Gen.G, to auto-qualify for Worlds without the regional qualifier. However, if KT wins that series, then things are a little bit more divisive, because KT would not immediately have enough points to auto-qualify for Worlds if they only get second place. They would need to win the LCK in order to get that auto-qualification spot. And so, certainly a lot needs to go down, you know, and there's certainly a lot of different interesting scenarios, but I do think that it creates probably the most interesting outcome we could have. As for T1 versus KT, of course, we've already seen this matchup in round number 2, with T1 going over in 5. I do think that that is definitely a possibility again here, but KT played really well in that series against Hanwha, and I think in general they have a better grasp on the meta and you know, on T1 in particular than they did going into that series, and so I do think it's going to be close. I think this one should be even closer, in my opinion, than what round 2 was for these two teams. I could really genuinely see either of these teams moving on to finals, and I wish I didn't have to make a prediction, because I really don't think that there is one team that should be favored over the other. This is about as close to a 50-50 as I could possibly predict, but I'm going to go for T1. I just think they're playing too well right now. I think getting back into the finals makes a lot of sense for this team. If it does end up being KT, I'm not going to be surprised even a little bit. In fact, you know, honestly, I could switch right now to KT. That genuinely is where I'm at. I really don't feel super confident in either of these teams losing, right? I think T1 looked better in that series against KT earlier, which is giving me the confidence, but KT looked better in that series against Hanwha than T1 did against Gen.G in the previous couple of games, and so I don't really know, right? It could go either way for me, but I think it's going to be fun either way, and telecom wars with major stakes like this are always intriguing, but of course, that's just my prediction. I'd love to know what you guys think down in the comments section below. Who do you think is going to be going over in that series? And then eventually, who do you think is going to be taking that LCK title? Would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot for me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it helps get this video out to a lot more people, which obviously I'm very appreciative of. Of course, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Worlds is right around the corner, and we cover all 4 of the major regions on this channel. So if you want some insight as to how a lot of the teams that are going to be heading to the World Championships are doing right before that tournament starts, this is the place for that. If you enjoyed this video, I promise you're going to enjoy a lot of the rest of the content I have as well. So hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.